Thank you so much, everybody. It's like surreal watching everybody come in. So glad you made time in your day. This is a really important topic to me personally, but also because I found throughout my social work education, my early training, becoming a therapist in private practice, it's not a very widely talked about topic in the sense of I don't see a lot of continuing education credits around it. I don't see a lot of talks around it. And I'll kind of get into this a little bit later. I think that what Daniela said about educating about the stigma and breaking the stigma that's a big part of this topic. There is a lot of shame around growing up in an alcoholic or dysfunctional home. So my hope is that through this talk, I can dismantle some of that shame and give language to what the experience is like for these people, and also how to get help and self-care through it, through therapy, and also just through taking care of yourself. So with that being said, I'll go ahead to just a little bit of an overview. And I'll pause on the first point there, the point of discussion about growing up in an alcoholic home. Kind of designed this from start to finish to talk about just the qualities of an alcoholic home, what it means to be an alcoholic, and then move towards the behaviors of an adult child, how therapy can help, hope around coping skills, exercises, learning self-care that you may not have learned in childhood, and then of course finishing with resources in the community so you can continue to educate yourself, educate your clients, educate loved ones. So again, I'll pause at that first point there, growing up in an alcoholic home. The term alcoholic has been a little confusing maybe in terms of like the DSM-5, which is what clinicians use to diagnose. It's evolved a lot as the DSM has evolved a lot in the field. But right now, as it stands, I won't read you, the whole diagnostic picture of what an alcoholic is, but it involves about 10 to 12, I think, traits that involve excessive drinking, drinking at inappropriate times, having drinking interfere with functioning in some way, feeling guilty about drinking, needing a drink in the morning to ease your hangover. These are all some of the common traits. Now, in order for someone in a black and white terminology to be diagnosed with a substance use disorder, you have to have at least two of these traits for a period of a year or more. That would give you a mild use disorder. So if you had more than two, then you range from moderate to severe, depending on how much it's impacting your functioning. So that can be kind of a black and white way to look at it. As we know, if you know somebody who's an alcoholic or grew up in an alcoholic home yourself, you know that sometimes it's not so finite like that. There are gray areas. A lot of people, clients I work with, or even people in my personal life ask me, well, my mom, my dad goes to work. They take care of things around the home. They never miss a meal. They don't miss my sports games. So they can't be an alcoholic, right? Because it doesn't interfere with their functioning. And the truth is there is like a slippery slope with that. And if drinking has ever made you uncomfortable as a child in your home for whatever reason, there's reason to believe that there was problematic behavior there. So while somebody may not meet diagnostic criteria, it is I believe it's a full spectrum of a kind of disorder where you could make multiple cases for somebody having problem drinking. So I just wanted to add that little anecdote. Now, there's another piece to this, which is the idea of a dysfunctional home. So dysfunctional homes can kind of overlap with alcoholic homes, but they might be characterized more by abusive situations where children are physically unsafe or emotionally unsafe, neglectful situations where basic needs are not met, emotionally unstable parents, such as somebody with let's say a narcissistic personality disorder, or another behavior that renders the parent unable to care for the child in the way that a child needs for proper development. So that's kind of what we mean when we say ACOA. It encompasses all of that, all of the qualities of a dysfunctional home. Also, just for semantics, I say parent, but when I use the word parent, I just want you to know I mean anyone that's a caretaker or an important person in the child's development. It could be a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, a family friend, but for semantic purposes, that's what parent means. Something that all of these homes have in common is a lack of validation and a lack of emotional presence on the part of the parent. So even if the parent is showing up and doing all of the things that you're supposed to do as a caregiver. There might be a lack of emotional involvement or investment that can leave the child feeling very alone and confused. There also is a sense of, as I said before, shame, stigma, a feeling that there's something wrong with you, that your home is different than other homes, that your parents are different than other parents, and fear, living in sometimes for some people, a constant state of fear. These are all common themes of growing up in these types of homes. So moving on to the next part of this discussion, which is the common traits and behaviors of growing up in an alcoholic home. This is not an exhaustive list. I just want to preface that by saying these are the things that tend to show up a lot in my practice and people I talk to. There are certainly much more, and I will try really, really hard to get to all of them, but sometimes when I do that, I talk a little too fast. So I want to make sure I get to the most important ones. I also want to say that here I have on the slide common traits, but really what these are survival skills. On the other end of the spectrum, these are things that children, as they turn into adolescents and adults, really grab onto because in many ways, these traits saved them from feeling too emotionally overwhelmed in childhood. So I'll kind of explain how that spectrum works as we go through each one. The other thing I want to say is all of these, you'll see maybe a theme here if you are a clinician, these are all anxiety behaviors and traits. ACOAs have a very unique set of anxiety, which I also think is why it's hard to find a lot of talks about it or CEUs referencing this kind of anxiety, because it's more than just generalized worry and panic, but it's not quite always PTSD. So it's sort of in this gray area. So I'm hoping to capture some of that here when I explain these. So first on the list is perfectionism and control issues. This can manifest in beliefs such as like, I have to be perfect or else I won't be loved. If I don't do everything right, my parent is going to abandon me. These might be the real fears and real thoughts that come into our heads as children. And so as a result, we internalize things. We're very harsh on ourselves, relentless criticism, which actually sets us up more for failure than we would think because it's impossible to be perfect. On the other hand, with externalizing, we can expect this perfection from others. We can have very, I think I say this later in the list, rigid expectations that people meet that they just simply can't. In the work environment, this often shows up as micromanaging. I get many clients coming to me saying that on their performance reviews, their bosses are telling them they micromanage their peers, their direct reports, and it causes some problems. And it's because of that need to control. It can also show up as like getting very upset when things don't go the way that you want. If you have a certain vision in your head for how a social event is going to go or how something at work is going to go, and then it doesn't go that way, you feel totally, totally out of control and like inconsolable. So these are all some examples of perfectionism and control issues. Next on the list is conflict avoidance. This is also a very common one, also known as people pleasing in some cases. I think that ACOAs are very terrified by angry people and get confused by anger because of the way it comes out in the home. Sometimes it doesn't come out in the home, and that's even more complicated because you don't know what it looks like or how to address it. And as a result, we avoid conflict at all costs. We don't see it as constructive. We don't see it as a chance to build intimacy. It's just something that is dangerous, not to be trusted. We run away from conflict. The dangerous part about this one is that society really reinforces people-pleasing behavior, much like it reinforces perfectionism. If we're perfect, if we're the yes man, if we don't have any boundaries, people can take advantage of us, but we also get the promotion, we get the raise, we get the higher status, whatever that might mean in a situation. So just wanted to point out that those things are highly reinforced by society in a bigger system in addition to the family system. ACOAs are very confused and I think scared of intimacy at times. Because ACOAs are not modeled healthy relationships. It's kind of like when you get into a relationship, it's like, well, what am I supposed to do? I have no framework for what this looks like. As a result, there's a lot of self-sabotage that comes up in the form of either picking a partner who maybe you ignored red flags or knew they wouldn't be good for you, to recreate this cycle of abandonment, ironically, of, well, let me just prove myself right that, people are going to leave me and let me down. On the other hand, if you do find a stable, secure partner, sometimes the ACOA is the person who has the dysfunctional behavior. They push the person away because they don't want to get close. So it can kind of go in one or two ways. And I think a big part of intimacy too is intimacy with yourself, which I'll talk a little bit later when we talk about therapy and the role of self-care. But big part of intimacy is knowing your own feelings, and that can feel impossible at times too. I touched on rigid expectations a little bit already. I really think this is a survival skill. Black and white thinking about people and situations is a way that we make sense of the world when we're in a fear-based place. Our brains can't reason that there could be a gray area or a balanced way of thinking about things. It's this way or it's this way. And we get so used to doing that because our brains just developed that way that it's hard to see the middle ground. So a big part of therapy is seeing that you can be compassionate with people, you can make exceptions, you can see the gray area. Dissociation is also very common, and I find this so fascinating because there are so many levels to it. There is the classic dissociation, which is just complete numbing from your body. A lot of people describe it as like floating above their body, or like kind of like they're watching a scene unfold, happen in front of them, and they're not really grounded and in a part of it. But I've also worked with ACOAs who have very creative ways of dissociating, such as there's a joke going around on social media about like being the main character of your life. And I think a lot of ACOAs do this. They feel like they're in a movie. That's sort of like everything's happening around them and they're not really living and in their body, but it's more like they're playing a role in a cast, in a play or something. Also just daydreaming, frequently going into different fantasies and scenarios in your head is a very common, less risky, I guess, form of dissociation, but those are some things that might happen. Fear of abandonment is a big hallmark ACOA trait. Our nervous systems get so worn out in childhood from being on constant threat and alert that something might go wrong. We might lose our parent. They might get into a car accident if they're drinking. They might embarrass us. It's a very raw sense of a threat. And how this manifests in adulthood is we might find that small things trigger us. So, if somebody doesn't answer your text message as quickly as they usually do, or your boss like pings you for a meeting unexpectedly, you're like, oh my God, I'm going to get fired. These are examples of taking like a small stake situation and just jumping to abandonment right away. As a result, I think a lot of ACOAs get dismissed, sadly, as being clingy or needy or annoying. And this really isn't the case. And this is what I would really like to raise awareness about, is this is complex trauma playing out with these triggers. These triggers are not just, silly events to people. They feel like real threats. And that's where the fear of abandonment comes in. Shame and guilt, again, this theme will come up. Common thread. It's implicit that like we just don't talk about the alcoholism in the home. It's something that's swept under the rug. We kind of manage it silently as a family. We don't talk about it. We don't engage other families or rely on supports for it. We're just going to deal with it ourselves. And then you slowly start to realize that, well, then is there something wrong with me that this keeps happening? Like, why do I feel like I'm bad? I feel like people are different from me. A lot of teenagers grow up and they realize other homes are different than theirs. And it all goes back to this kind of core belief that is not rooted in reality or reason, but deep emotion that there is something wrong with you. And I think that is a big reason that a lot of people thankfully come to seek therapy to disprove that through the process of therapy. The last one, poor boundaries. This can kind of go either way. I really think ACOAs have a hard time with a happy medium there. I hear some people saying like they feel like they share too much with people too soon, kind of like word vomit. And then other people who are like, my boundaries are so rigid, I don't let anybody in. So it's usually kind of these extremes and having to find a happy medium in between them. Couple things that aren't on the slide that I just wanted to, that I thought of last night that I wanted to add. The idea of being a caretaker is a big ACOA trait. I think this comes from sometimes a codependent place. Everybody has to be a caretaker at some point in their life, usually, whether it's for a parent or a child or a friend. But chronic caretakers have this need to be needed that I think is rooted in caring for an alcoholic parent often. So big part of recovery is assertiveness training, independence, building your own life, and setting healthy boundaries there. The last point also that's not on the slide that I wanted to mention is that a lot of ACOAs do develop alcoholic, substance abusing, or other addictive behaviors. For the purposes of this presentation, because that is even more of a niche, an ACOA who is also struggling with substance, I don't focus so much on treatments, but I will give some insights as to where to go to look for those resources, if that's something that you're interested in. But for these purposes, this is for ACOAs who don't think they necessarily have an addictive behavior that they're struggling with. So how can therapy help? Well, obviously I have a lot to say about that as a therapist. I think the biggest and most important thing, and I love this quote, by the way, that I put up here: your trauma doesn't make you needy. You are searching for a need to be met that has been unmet your whole life. I found that on Instagram a few days ago. And I think it's so important because that's what therapy is. It is helping you meet that need. And you can do that by building real trust and experiencing what real boundaries are like with your therapist. The therapy space mimics, the idea is that it's going to mimic the outside world. So what goes on between you and your therapist can help you work out what's going on in your personal relationships. Your therapist can handle it. If you come in, frustrated and angry that your therapist took a vacation for 2 weeks and abandoned you, that's a perfect time to explore what abandonment means to you and to work it out with this safe person in this safe space. A therapist is not going to abandon you, hopefully. The idea is that they will be there reliably, predictably, same day, same week, every day, the same time every week. And that can be really healing, just to know that you even have that space, because a lot of people didn't. Also, being honest and owning your story about your narrative. Sometimes people need to rewrite their narrative a little bit because it's not serving them anymore. They want to focus more on their resilience, and your therapist can help you do that. They can help you point out maybe memories where you remembered something a certain way, but then later uncovered another truth that kind of disproved that memory or disproved that belief. I really think that narrative therapy is a huge part of this kind of recovery. A safe place for your struggles to emerge. I kind of touched on that with the vacation example. It's okay to project things onto your therapist. They can handle it. That's what they're there for. They'll help you work through it. More concrete things are like coping skills, using role playing. So maybe, and I'll touch on this a little later, but how to set a boundary with a loved one, and just learning basic self-care. So what did you not experience as a child? Was it that you didn't get a chance to play, that you didn't get a chance to relax? Maybe you really wanted to learn an instrument, but your parents thought, that was selfish and dumb, and things like that. So ways that you can get in touch with not only your inner child, but also now your adult that, as yourself, that knows that you can take advantage of these things. So if you are looking for a therapist and you're an ACOA or come from a dysfunctional family, things that I would advise that you look for, just a couple. I mean, everybody's different. And of course you want to read, the bio on Psychology Today and see if it's a good fit. But ideally somebody with trauma experience is good because they understand the relationship between what's going on in your mind and how it's stored in your body. And they can help you work through that. As a subset to trauma, I recommend EMDR as well. EMDR is it's very hard to explain. It uses eye movement and also various other forms of stimulation to kind of unlearn memories and core beliefs that you have about yourself that are no longer serving you, and replace them with more balanced thoughts. EMDR is separate from trauma. So not all trauma therapists are EMDR trained. So just make sure to make a note of that. Also, any therapist that says they're interpersonal is wonderful, because they understand the dynamic that the therapeutic relationship will play in the healing. And just as a side note, for ACOAs who are struggling also with alcohol or substance abuse, if you look for a CASAC in New York, at least, I think there's some people from New Jersey and other states on here. In New York, it's called a CASAC. It's CASAC. That stands for Certified Alcohol and Substance Abuse Counselor. So they can work in conjunction with the other forms of therapy. So that is about therapy. And moving right along to coping skills and exercises. At a good place, we started off as a very CBT based practice. We've since expanded to include a lot of other modalities and approaches, but that's kind of like where my foundational training lies. So I did include this little graphic from A Good Place over there on the right that just shows the relationship between our behaviors, our thinking, and our feelings. This is important for ACOA work because, as I kind of illustrated with the common traits, a lot of the ways that we act and think and behave come from core beliefs that we learned from our families and also from society. But for the purposes of this talk, it's been what was going on in the home. So you may have learned from a traumatic memory something about yourself that feels shameful, or something that you believe about yourself that may not be true, that's shameful. So CBT can help with core beliefs, and also with those worst case scenarios that come from the triggers of being abandoned. So before I gave some examples about getting a text message from somebody and worrying you're going to be abandoned, or something about your boss. So one thing I love to do with my clients is if they come in really heightened and the worst case scenario is definitely going to happen. So, I'll indulge them for a little bit and say, well, tell me about the worst case scenario. What is the absolute worst case that will happen? Tell me the best case. What is the best possible thing that could happen? So the total opposite. If everything goes smoothly, what will happen? And then somewhere in the middle. So now, considering both of those ends of the spectrum, what do you think is most likely? 9 times out of 10, they're like, it's actually the best case scenario that's probably going to happen. So even just giving yourself some space to feel it out and consider other options and bouncing that off of another person can be really helpful. But you can also write that out yourself in like a journaling exercise. The other exercise I like for that is the 2-to-1 ratio. So if you're finding yourself having a lot of negative thoughts about something coming up, or maybe even about yourself, if you're just having a really low self-esteem day, I challenge my clients to, okay, for every one negative thing you've said, I want you to say 2 positive things. Or maybe if positive is a stretch, just something neutral, something that's not supercharged, just to kind of balance that scale, because it takes a lot of work to undo negative thinking patterns. If you think about, growing up in an alcoholic home or a dysfunctional home where there's been a lot of trauma, these ways of thinking have been around for years. I mean, you've grown into adulthood with these thoughts. So they're not just going to go away like that. It takes a lot of work and conscious effort to do that. It's also a really good reason not to beat yourself up, because it does take some time and it does take patience. I may have touched on this before when I talked about survival skills, but understanding and reframing our problems as behaviors that once served to protect us, I think, is very, very important. I often ask my clients, how have your survival skills made you stronger? An example of this might be, a perfectionist is typically very organized, detail-oriented, conscientious, a hard worker. I mean, these are all great things to succeed and to make other people feel confident in your company, especially in a work environment. It makes you reliable. There are plenty of good, compassionate ways that you can look about these problems or these survival skills. Similarly, if you're a caretaker, and you like taking care. I'm sure you're an excellent party planner. You're probably the first person that goes and brings all of your friends together. There's always like a positive side to these things. You just have to find the balance between like harnessing that resilience and kind of letting go of the rigidity of the negative. Yeah. Exposure exercises is another helpful thing, definitely to do in conjunction with a therapist, because exposure can be pretty intense. I find this to be very helpful in situations where social anxiety comes up. Like I said before, a lot of ACOAs can feel awkward in social situations and not know what's normal. So setting up a hierarchy of, well, why don't we start by just like getting coffee with somebody new? Or if that feels so scary, we'll start with something even lower. And then you gradually build up to your goal, which is maybe to go on a first date with somebody. And along the way, you can explore what it's like to be intimate and to sit with the discomfort of knowing that somebody knows something really intimate about you, and that's okay. They might not leave you. And also, if they leave you, you're going to be okay. So exposure can be helpful. Role-playing boundary setting. I love the DEAR skill, which is from Marshall Linehan's DBT manual. The DEAR stands for describe, express, assert, and reinforce. It is something to use when you would like to ask somebody for something in an assertive, kind way. So you describe the situation, I think I used this example in my Instagram a few weeks ago, but like, I would really like you not to drink when you're around my you've been drinking a lot when you're around my children, and it makes me uncomfortable. That would be describing. Expressing what you would like might be, I would like you to not do that. I would like you to be sober when you're around my kids. Assert would be, I am not going to bring my children around if I find out that you're drinking. And reinforce would be, I really care about you. I love having you in the family, and I want to be able to see you if we can make this work. So it like wraps it up nicely with positivity at the end. So that's a great skill. You can Google it. There's a ton of worksheets about it online, which is great. So it's very accessible. So writing prompts. This is kind of like, I guess, the more personal part of the ACOA work. This is a lot of what I focus on in my workbook that is being published next month. There are a lot of exercises with room to journal. So one of my favorites is the first one, I am allowed to, giving your inner child permission to do something that was not allowed. And it can be very tangible, like, I am allowed to go get ice cream for dinner. Or I am allowed to, I'm allowed to be silly. But it could also be something deeper, like I am allowed to feel angry, or I'm allowed to tell somebody that I'm angry and I have a right to do that. So this takes a little bit of work to kind of reflect on, and it can be painful to go back to the past and relive some of these memories, but it is important for you to do that in order to move forward and tell yourself, I have so much more power as an adult over myself. Similarly, a self-compassion letter. ACOAs struggle a lot with self-compassion. That is why there's so much stigma and shame. The quickest way to access self-compassion is to picture somebody that you know loves you unconditionally, whether it could be anybody, a friend, a teacher, a pet even. And I actually did this with somebody and their dog. And I was like, oh, what do you think your dog is thinking about you? And they're like, well, my dog loves me unconditionally. And we worked with that because it's important to feel that unconditional positive regard for yourself, not only having it come from somebody else, but harnessing it through the power of someone else can be nice. So, you just write your problem or what you're struggling with, and then you write what you imagine your friend would say back to you. Letter to your parent is probably the most cathartic and at times the most difficult, which is why I always preface it by saying you do not have to send this letter. You can write it just for you. You can say whatever curse words you want. You can blame. It's fine. I do recommend writing like an unfiltered one and then maybe another filtered one coming more from your adult self. And then deciding if you would like to send it or share pieces of it with them. But that can be really helpful in helping you heal and move on from some of the things that happened in the past that were not your fault. So self-care, my favorite topic, as many of you know. Um, I think that when we're trying to learn how to care about ourselves, it's really hard just to intuitively know that when it was never modeled for you or taught to you. It's kind of like when people say, well, just be happy. It's like, well, if I could, I would do that, but I don't really have the resources to do that all the time. So my advice for that is to learn how to get in touch with yourself. First, use your surroundings as much as you can, because they're going to be there for you. You can cultivate a strong supportive network of friends. Your friends say a lot about you, and the way that you feel about yourself is going to be reflected in who you hang out with and who supports you. So that would be, my first big advice. Nature is, I think, so underrated. It is so healing just to be in a place that doesn't judge you and is just has been here for you for forever to support you. So going to your favorite place, whether it's in a park or by the beach, that's my personal, whenever we do exercises of visualization in trainings at work, and they're like, imagine yourself in a relaxing nature place. It's like, I'm at the beach immediately. You don't even have to like finish your sentence. I'm already at the beach in my head. Places like that where you feel really connected and calm are healing. And getting in touch with your body. So it might take your mind and your emotions a little while to catch up to this work, because it is so daunting and it can be really, really hard. But if you can feel where your emotions are happening in your body, for instance, if you know that anxiety happens in your chest, that's a great start. Then you can figure out how to take care of that. If you know that dread happens in your gut or in your stomach, also a great way to know how to take care of yourself. So these are some foundations. And from here, then you can learn, oh, I really like to exercise. And actually, I wanted to make a point about exercise, because I think for perfectionists, exercise can be a double-edged sword, I myself included in that. When you're getting started with self-care, I would definitely promote compassionate exercise. And what I mean by compassionate exercise is exercise that isn't really tangible or metrics based. So not glancing at your watch to see what your pace is or how many miles you've run, for me, like it's on the Peloton, like I didn't meet my output again, because the metrics can you can use them to get down on yourself. So choosing something like yoga or going for a walk without your watch on, or maybe without your phone for a little bit, just to like feel the physicality of the exercise as opposed to the metrics. I think that's a more compassionate way to get inside your body. So some community resources, ACOA meetings. I am not sure. I tried to find out what they're doing in terms of with the pandemic online. I couldn't get a great answer, but I did find these phone numbers and emails, and I would assume most of them are still virtual at this time. I couldn't find any definitive in-person places that are meeting right now. I do know there is a great one at the LGBTQ Center in West Village. That one is wonderful and very inclusive. Websites, adultchildren.org, and for Al-Anon, if you don't quite identify as an adult child, but you are struggling with an alcoholic in your family, Al-Anon would be perfect for you. Of course, if you are struggling with alcohol yourself, AA is a great place to start. Super, super inclusive, especially here in New York City. And then books specifically about ACOAs. We have my book, which is coming out next month, which is a workbook, as I said. So there's a lot of room for journaling and self-reflection in between text, which is great. The big red book is kind of like the place to go for ACOA, and that's written by the World Service Organization. You can find that on Amazon. It's a little bit pricey, but I think if you download it on your Kindle, it's a little bit more reasonable. And then Janet Woiditz wrote Adult Children of Alcoholics, which was widely popularized in the 90s, I believe. And it's kind of timeless, because everything she talks about still holds true today in terms of coping and how the traits manifest themselves. That is pretty much all I have in terms of resources and clinical clinical things and groups. So I know I'm a little bit early for once. Wow. I'm very impressed with myself, but I guess it would be great to open it up for questions if people have questions.
I don't see any questions yet, but Kara, maybe you can just talk a little bit more about the deer points that you were talking about. That was I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. So I'll go back to that slide. So the DEAR scale for assertiveness. So it's the purpose of it is kind of to provide structure to something that can feel very unstructured for people, especially for people who aren't used to asking for what they want. And yeah, it might, describing the situation is just a way of putting it into perspective for the person to see it from your point of view. Expressing what you need and what you want is a way of honoring your own need. Asserting what's kind of like the consequences or what's going to happen is usually the hardest part, because that usually involves like really setting the boundary of, like, in the example I gave, I'm not going to bring you around. I'm not going to bring my kids around if you're drinking. I think that was the example I gave. And then reinforcing it's just nice to end on a positive note. Like, I'm doing this, basically I'm doing this because I love you and I care about you, kind of thing. So I just think it's a great framework. I love acronyms because they're so easy to remember. Yeah.
Thank you. And if anyone else has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Elba appreciates the reinforcement of the importance of self-care.
Yes. It's so hard when I hear a lot of people say they don't know how to do it because they've never been socialized to it, which might be hard for some of us to imagine, but depending on how you grew up, it can be understandable. And I think that's why it's okay to look externally at first before you look internally, because that's where you can find a lot of like that reflection validated back at you. And then you start to believe it when your friends tell you they love you enough. It's like, well, I can't be that terrible if everybody's telling me, I'm this special. So it's just a good example of how to get started with it.
We have a question here. How do you generally incorporate this work and these skills into your work within sessions with clients?
Great question. I will say that a lot of people come in. I don't know if denial is the right word, but without an awareness that they may have grown up in a home like this, that meaning an alcoholic or dysfunctional home. The first phase for me is always establishing that trust and modeling basically whatever that person may not have gotten. Then I might do a little, it's always hard to clinically point out, like that might not have been how was that for you? Does that feel like that was normal? Like it's hard to kind of point that out. But usually it comes out in the form of other relationships or with other friendships, I find, or at work. Work is a big one too. So I'll use, I'm kind of rambling, but to answer your question, I'll use whatever is going on in the present day if the client is not ready to look back at the past yet. And then eventually when there's enough trust, you can start to draw parallels, or if you remember one or two things that were really significant that the client said about their family history, about their parents, you can tie that back. When you say you talk about your struggles with your boss, it really reminds me of what you said about your dad, or something like that. In the beginning, clients are usually looking for not quick fixes. I don't want to say that, but they want like skills. So CBT is a great way to start, always just a way to examine those core beliefs. I use a lot of the downward arrow technique, which is basically just asking somebody, well, what would that mean? And what would that mean about you, over and over again until you get to the core belief. And then you can really do examining of where that core belief came from. So to sum it up, I'd say trust, use what the client is bringing in, to you in the present as information about the past, and use CBT skills to become aware of the thinking patterns.
Thank you, Kara. We're getting several questions here. We just want to have enough time for all of them. Another one is, could you say a little bit more about how this is a different type of anxiety? Haley says, I like what you said about it not being general anxiety, but not always PTSD either.
Yeah, definitely. I that actually came to me fairly recently, and I think it was when I was again trying to find more literature on the subject. Um, I think part of it is because it's the trauma is very insidious, and by that I mean it happens in very small moments that you may not realize as big, like a big event, like a car crash or you know something else traumatic. It could, it also is, it builds over time. I think that's the other thing that makes it different, because it starts when you're a child, and it starts when you don't have the language or the language part of your brain developed enough to know what's going on. So all you have is your body, and you're left with these sensations of, well, what is this? And then your mind catches up to you by the time you're a teenager, and then you just have shame because you're like, well, why is my family like this? So I think the fact that it builds upon each other like that, and the fact that it is so complex and insidious is what makes it different. It also, though, the reason I wanted to put resilience in this chat is because it makes, like, these traits make us very resilient by going through them, like perfectionism, conflict avoidance, like they're very resilient traits. They just go a little bit too far.
Thank you. We have another one.
Mm-hmm.
Meredith gives a personal example about how she sent an email, and I hope this is okay, Meredith, that I'm saying it out loud. I figured you put it in the chat. But Meredith wants advice on how to handle someone who is not receptive to talking about your feelings. She mentions that she sent an email to her mom regarding her feelings after a vacation that involved a lot of drinking on her end. And there were a lot of negative and uncomfortable moments during that vacation. And she framed the email with a dear type of outline to her mom, but unfortunately, it was not positively received. So she really wants to know, how do you suggest handling someone who is not receptive to your talking and your feelings?
That's so tough, and I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that was the response to that. And I think that happens a lot when we set a boundary. People get very uncomfortable with it because it's, we are no longer playing the role that we used to play, which is to be, and I'm not saying this applies to you personally, but you know, we're not going to just not speak up. We're not just going to let it happen. We're not going to be complacent. It's like that can make people really uncomfortable. What I will say is, the fact that you set the boundary is the success. I know it doesn't always seem like that because of the harsh response that you got, or because maybe your mom is not going to change right away, or she's indicating she won't change. But you setting the boundary is the measure of success. So if you continue to keep yourself first and protect yourself by doing those things, that is the most important part of this work. The other half, which is a big part of AA's philosophy, is that there are going to be some things about people that we can't change. And that might have to be part of this particular growth is, well, what am I able to change? I am able to stick up for myself and keep saying that this is a big deal. I'm not going to be able to control how she responds all the time. And like finding the balance between what you can and what you can't control. It's really, really hard.
Thank you, Kara. And actually, if anyone is interested, Kara talks a lot about that on her Instagram. I follow her on Instagram, and I always see her offering really great tips on what to do when someone's overstepping the boundary that you set. So you can always go to Kara's Instagram to see that. And we have another question. Mary says, I have most of the traits you describe. Interesting. I never drank that much, and I thought, great, I'm not an alcoholic. Took me many more years to understand it had nothing to do with alcohol, but I still had these traits. So you were talking, Kara, about earlier how it's not necessarily only related to alcoholism.
Right. Right. Um, so I just want to make sure I understand, it was that that
Yeah, I guess
alcohol, what
it was
wasn't it?
more of a it was more of a statement than a question, but she's saying, I have most of the traits you described. Interesting. I never drank that much and thought, great, I'm not an alcoholic. Took me many more years to understand it had nothing to do with alcohol. I still had all the traits.
All the traits. Yes, yes. A lot of people call this in AA, sometimes they call it like being a dry. I'm not saying this applies to you necessarily, but it's called like being a dry drunk. Like you have all of the um a lot of the traits of an alcoholic, but you never picked up the drink, or you stopped drinking, or you're in recovery. And it just goes to show how many different systems can come into play to create these behaviors. But I really, again, think that like I just like I've said this probably so many times at this point, but these behaviors really save people's lives as kids. Some of these traits, as rigid as and as inflexible as they are, they're there because they help us feel safe. So tapping into the parts, tapping into that side of the spectrum is where the resilience comes in.
We have another question here. We have a lot, so maybe
Keep
we
them
can.
coming. I know if people have to go, it's 12. So, oh, we have some time though. So that's good.
Yeah, we have several more minutes, but in supervising addiction counselors, would you also recommend the use of these key components discussed in helping to identify trauma in clients and how it relates in both transference and countertransference?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that um, it's a wonderful resource, addiction counselors, especially when the family comes into play, because, well, again, as I said, alcoholism is very genetic. So if you're working with an alcoholic or someone who substance abuses, chances are there was someone in the family, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, mother, father, who had that. So you can definitely tackle those issues using like a workbook such as mine, or a program such as ACOA. But also it's really useful for the person struggling with alcohol use or the identified patient to see what the family has gone through, right? So, you know, I think of like I think of like This Is Us. I know that's like so corny, but it's like my favorite show. Like Kevin, if anyone watches, Kevin is the identified alcoholic in the family. But Kate struggles with her weight issues, and Randall struggles with his identity issues, and the father, Jack, was an alcoholic. And it's when they have that scene a few seasons back where they're all at the treatment center, and it's like Kevin gets to talk, but then everyone else is like, I have my shit too. I think, excuse my language. I think that's a perfect example of how it can be really useful for the substance abusing person to have some empathy of like, wow, I was not the only person affected by this. Like, look how it manifested in other parts of the family. I know that was a little bit of tangent to your question, but the short answer is yes, it can be helpful for sure.
Thank you, Kara. We have a few more. Anne Marie is asking, she says this was everyone is just loving this presentation. Everyone really appreciates this talk. Anne Marie says, could you give pointers on finding the tools? I think it was specifically regarding assertiveness that are accessible on the internet.
Yes. So DEAR is the first one for DBT. There are so many others.
We could also in
I
the follow
generate an email. Yeah, I would love
yeah,
to.
we could share it. When we share the recording, we can also include some bullets of the tools.
Yes, absolutely. Because I know there are more in the workbook. I have the workbook on my laptop. I just don't want to pull it up and disrupt the screen. So I can definitely send those out.
Thank you. Haley is asking regarding setting boundaries with others and accepting that they may not respect them. The Serenity Prayer from ACOA has been such a great tool for me in moments of struggle. Grant me this quote, grant me the serenity to accept the people I cannot change, the courage to change the one I can, and the wisdom to know that one is me.
Yes, I love that. And I actually have not heard that particular rendition of it. I'm used to the one that says, accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, but making it say people is so much more personal. And yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I love that.
Sue is asking, specifically if you know any counselors or support groups in Massachusetts.
Yes, I do. I would love to get Sue's information so I can email her.
Sure. Sue, maybe just send me an email, and that way I can just forward you and connect you with Kara directly, if that's okay.
I have
Um,
somebody in mind, but I'm just not sure with insurance and out of network and all that. So I don't want to, yeah.
um, Someone's asking, how helpful is Al-Anon in your view?
Hmm. I have not personally been to an Al-Anon. Is that true? I think I might have gone to an Al-Anon meeting, but it was for a course in school. Like I was supposed to observe the group. I have heard from many people close to me, many people, that it is a wonderful resource that you make lifelong friends. Not that that's entirely the purpose, but supports, I guess is a better way to put it. That it helps you relinquish the control that we were just talking about of other people and other people's behaviors. It helps you decide what your limit is, what you're willing to put up with somebody. Can help you learn to communicate. I've heard nothing but wonderful things about it. And also the World Service Organizations put out these great little, I meant to add this to the book list, daily affirmations books that they're like a one day at a time type of thing. And it's like a passage, not, I don't know that they're all religious, but more spiritual, like something to think about for the day and like an intention to set. And then you just read one a day, maybe in the morning, and it helps you kind of keep you centered around a theme. And those are really great too. I have a bunch of those in my drawer.
Just wanted to share a few other point, not questions, but some feedback. Carrie says, I love the concrete CBT skills presented. It's so helpful for people to access their own resources to examine and make changes once they identify these patterns. We can always grow our resilience.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's great to have opportunity. It's once you see the opportunity for resilience, it's like the world is your oyster. A lot of people don't know they have that opportunity. They think it's just, this is the way it is for my life because this is the way it's always been. But there's always an opportunity to be resilient.
We have another from Trudy. She says, I really like the strengths-based aspect of therapy that you covered. Among other things, it helps a client feel more positive at the beginning of therapy and gives them a place to start to grow.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's like I think people come to therapy and they're kind of grasping at straws sometimes. Like that's the whole point why they come to therapy, because nothing's worked. So it's nice to be able to give a tangible thing, at least in the beginning. But I always see it as a stepping stone for the deeper work because, you know, my clients that have been with me 2-3 years now, it's like we're really getting into it and it feels so good. Not that the early work wasn't gratifying, but it's just, you know, you get the skills, you get yourself together, you leave the toxic job, the relationship, and then you can like really get into working on yourself, which is just wonderful.
Well, that's all the questions we have. Thank you everyone for writing in such great questions.
Yeah, thank you everyone so much. This really means a lot that this many people showed up for this kind of a topic. Like I said, I think it needs more I think it needs more shame busting out there. You know, we need to get the shame away from it. So I was very happy to do this talk.